is Face the Diaspora, a platform for conversations on Eritrea. Your host, Russom Mesfun. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest today is Martin Plaut, former BBC reporter and author of several books on Africa. Mr. Plaut joined the BBC in 1984, working primarily on Africa. He was appointed Africa editor, BBC World Service News, a position he held until retirement in November 2012. Mr. Plaut was an associate fellow of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, leading their Africa research program, and is an active member. Currently, he's a fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. His publications include War in the Horn, Unfinished Business, Ethiopia and Eritrea at War, Ethiopia and Eritrea, Allergic to Persuasion. Martin, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to Face the Diaspora. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Martin, did you do any follow-up since your conversation with the RB Harnet folks?
I haven't known. We've been working on some other things, and to be honest, there are quite a range of issues that I'm involved in, so sometimes they're Eritrean and sometimes they're not.
So do you have any information from Eritrea whatsoever?
I have no further information than the information that was published, that I published in The Guardian. That really summarized what we discovered at that particular moment. Obviously, one hears all sorts of things, but, I try to be, careful about what we put out. And so that is really the latest that I understand the situation to be.
Well, you said one hears all sorts of things. Well, what sorts of things is one hearing?
I'm a journalist. I hear things about all sorts of things, but I can't possibly go into what I hear because that is not my role. I mean, this is there's a difference between what you hear in private and what you hear in public. Let me give you just one simple example. I have heard that there is a support for for Boko Haram, the Islamist grouping that is fighting in northern Nigeria, is coming through Chad and involves money from Qatar. Now, that's something I cannot verify. I'm just telling you that I'm hearing that as a story. But I wouldn't go out with it. I wouldn't make that public apart from describing it to you. And I have no more detail about it. And there are other stories that I'm working on. I don't only work on Eritrea.
Fair enough. But nothing within the Eritrean context, right?
I'm afraid not. No, I can't say any more.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Now, because we were actually looking for you that day, I think it was a Saturday, and we were able to get hold of your partner there, Leonard Vincent. What was that experience like, and can you just summarize how it was like to actually have a conversation with people deep in the heart of the PFDJ territory?
It was very moving. It was really extraordinary. I mean, the courage of these people. Of course, I don't know their real names, but their courage in deciding to speak to us and to be frank and honest and open with international journalists. We could see the number in Eritrea, so we knew that we were speaking to Eritrea, and it just had the ring of authenticity about it.
Martin, that I had absolutely no idea that you're actually originally from South Africa and that you are a student activist doing the anti-apartheid movement. So does that remind you of those days?
It does. I remember very, very well in the 1960s, 1970s in particular, leading up to the Soweto uprising of 1976, the tension inside South Africa Now, I mean, South Africa was never as repressive as Eritrea was. I mean, there was a free press, there was democracy of a kind. I mean, whites could vote, and, you know, members of parliament lost their seats. There was a constitution, there was rule of law. I mean, I'm not trying to sort of soft soap. The situation in South Africa was an appalling form of racism, but it was nowhere near as repressive as Eritrea is now. Where, you know, I mean, there's hardly a blade of grass that moves without the regime knowing about it. So, no, I mean, but I remember the tension in South Africa at that time when one was involved in things. And I mean, look, I was a white student. My life was fairly, I was comfortable, and I was fairly secure. You know, it wasn't like some of the black kids that we were trying to work with. I mean, they were putting their lives on the line every single day, and they were extremely brave. I mean, what we did pales into insignificance compared with what the workers that we worked with and the student activists.
Martin, Eritreans are in animated conversations about the country and how to remove the regime from power. Are you privy to such conversations, and what do you read into them?
Well, yes, I certainly hear them, and I hear all sorts of things, but those are just discussions. And I wouldn't say that I have any great insight into the attempts to remove the government of President Isaias. And quite frankly, you know, that is something for Eritreans to decide on. This is an internal matter that you will have to deal with. I mean, it is an absolute tragedy that Eritrea is now in the situation that you have to talk about regime change in a country that is, you know, only as old as Eritrea is absolutely sad. You know, I feel very bad about it, but this is your problem. It's, you know, as an African, I feel involved in it, and as a human being, of course, I'm involved in it. But this is something that will have to be decided by Eritreans.
So you actually identify yourself as an African. When do you have dual citizenship? Are you also a citizen of the UK?
I'm actually a citizen of Germany. I'm a citizen of South Africa. But I suppose if you really wanted to know my citizenship, I'm a Londoner. And like most Londoners, I wasn't born in this town.
Fair enough, fair enough. Moving on, Martin, let's go to your specialization, actually. You are an expert in the Horn of Africa. Have you developed a theory about the region, and what do these places have in common, or the regimes for that matter?
I find the Horn particularly interesting because of its unique history in Africa. I mean, it is singled out from the rest of Africa partly really by one defining characteristic. If one leaves aside, shall we say, the far north of Africa and the Arab world, which it really is part of, if one looks at sub-Saharan Africa, then, you know, the whole of the Horn is unique in as much as it had a written culture. And that meant that the history of the Horn is much deeper and much longer than most of the rest of Africa. I mean, of course, if one goes through the archaeology, one can look at a place like Great Zimbabwe in Zimbabwe, which goes back hundreds of years and is well dated and well known. But the actual origins of that much of it is lost because there is no written culture. And in most places you go to in Africa, you don't find a written culture. And therefore, of course, it is a question of either using the folk memories of people or the colonial representation of that culture, which is most unsatisfactory. Eritrea, Ethiopia, both of them have written cultures, and therefore, you have a depth of history and a depth of knowledge about yourselves and an awareness of your history and your place in that history, which really makes it different from the rest of Africa. And, I find the people of Ethiopia and Eritrea, and I make no distinction between them as people. I'm close to both groups of people. I'm not trying to suggest that they should be the same country, but I mean that they are fascinating people, and I respect their cultures enormously.
You wrote this piece, Martin, saying I've been working on Africa since 1970s, and now as I leave the BBC, I look at the continent of my birth and see a brighter future that anytime I can remember. It's a great piece. Tell me about that. Do you still have the same feeling?
I do. I think that Africa is moving in the right direction. Young Africans don't have the sense of deference towards their political leadership that many of their elders had. It is becoming a more urbanized, a more modernized society if one looks at the whole of the continent. There are great things that you can look at. That doesn't mean that one should ever close one's eyes to the problems that Africa faces. But, Africa is always an enormously robust and cheerful and optimistic place to work in, which is frankly why I've always loved working in Africa. You try working in Eastern Europe, you can't imagine anything that's more dreary and dull and depressing. I had colleagues who worked there, and there was always long faces. I've never known working in Africa on Africa for 30 years. I never knew a long face, no matter how bad the situation was. People are always extraordinarily optimistic and resilient.
Can you actually share with our listeners about how you came to befriend Eritreans? I think there was an encounter with, was it Ermias Debesay?
Indeed, there was. I arrived in the UK in about 77, and I did a year at university. Then I tried to get a job. I remained in the UK because I frankly fell in love with a British woman and stayed. We got married, and I then tried to get a job. I couldn't get one, so eventually I worked for Mobil Oil for 1 year, which was not my happiest year. Arriving at a global multinational selling oil on a bicycle isn't guaranteed to win you any brownie points. They look at you as you're insane. And then I worked for the Labour Party, the British Labour Party, from about 79 to 84 when I joined the BBC. And it was in that period when I was working for the Labour Party as the Africa Secretary that I came into contact with a number of liberation movements, and the EPLF was one of them. And as you say, a tall young man, Ermias Debesay, walked into my office. He'd made an appointment, and after a few pleasantries, he said to me, "You must come to my country." And I said to him, "But isn't Eritrea at war?" He said, "Yes, no problem. Come to, if you can get yourself to Port Sudan, we will do the rest." And I thought about it, and I thought, this is fascinating. I know absolutely nothing about Eritrea. I knew little enough about even Ethiopia at the time. I read up a bit about it, and I thought, yeah, I must go. This is an opportunity. So I went to Eritrea at the invitation of the EPLF. And it was I know the exact date, although I can't give it to you, because it was the day that we were there for the first Congress of the National Union of, I think, Eritrean Workers, and I think it was the second Congress of the National Union of Eritrean Women, which the EPLF had founded. And I think there was the joint meeting, and I remember it was an extraordinary journey. I mean, we were told we could leave our passports, all our money in Port Sudan, and I must admit we took them with us. And we got into a truck and we just headed into the desert. And I'd never experienced anything like it in my life. And after 36 extremely bumpy and uncomfortable hours, during which time our drivers talked the entire time. I don't know what on earth they talked about. We finally came into the field, and then we were met with the EPLF, which was an amazing experience.
Do you remember the year that this is happening, of course, and the month?
I can't tell you. If you know when the first Congress of National Union of Eritrean Workers was, then that was when it was. But I cannot remember. It was 81, 82, something like that. That was the period that it took place.
So how long did you actually stay there, and how far did you travel in Eritrea, and then what were you able to make out of your experience there, and when you went back, what was it like?
Well, that first time that I went in I went in twice during the War of Liberation, and the first time I went in, they were both about 10-day trips, and we saw a fair amount. We saw the hospital, which was dug into the side of the cliffs. I remember it very, very well. The kind of circumstances that it was in, and how they would treat the injured in these caves, because of course the Ethiopian Air Force had the ability to bomb at any time, and so they had to put these deep into the cliffs, and they looked after the wounded extremely well, as far as I could see. And we then attended the conference, and there was also then a session, which was again amazing. I remember Lion Cliff was with me at the time, the British academic. He's now died, and we were also then presented with a whole series of papers and discussions by the leadership of the EPLF when they went through what each of their departments, effectively ministries, were doing in the field, and they asked for criticism. They wanted criticism. They felt they'd become too internal, that they had too little, external perspective, and we did what we could. I mean, to be absolutely honest, I'm not convinced we did a great job on it, because they knew what they were doing, and there was only so much you could possibly advise anybody in these circumstances. But that is what we did. We were asked to do, and that is what we did. And of course, we saw a little bit of the military, but not much. Most of it was, quite rightly, they didn't share their military secrets with us.
Well, do you recall any of that criticism? What feedback did you give them?
Oh, it was, the sort of thing, about how, how do you run an education system? What sort of methods can you use? I don't remember it in detail, to be honest with you. I do remember some of the discussions with the media side, because I was involved in that, and I was talking about the problems of plurality, particularly after independence, because I wondered how they were going to deal with that, because they were so sure that they would be able to handle any problem. And I said to them, but there are lots of issues that arise. I mean, I knew, because I'd worked for the British Labour Party, what it was like to be in government. The pressure that you're under is extremely intense. And, very often the media can, criticize you for doing things. And how are you going to deal with that? And they said, no, there won't be any criticism. There won't be any problem. It'll be fine. It'll be okay. So I said, well, look, just imagine, for example, that you get into an economic crisis and the IMF tells you to do one thing, but your people want you to do another. How would you deal with that? Oh, that would never happen. I thought, no, hang on. These things can happen. But they just could not see that there could be any situation in which there was a divergence between what the people and the government would say. And I said to them, one day that will happen to you. I'm afraid I was right and they were wrong. Of course, there's always a divergence between the people and a government when you're in power. And that is the fate of all governments. There's nothing special about the Eritrea.
Do you remember any members of leadership that you interacted with at that time and had the opportunity to actually give them feedback?
I spoke to Isaias, and he was very impressive as a figure. I mean, he was certainly in complete control and charge of what he was doing, and you mustn't forget that we had very little idea of what was going on inside Eritrea that wasn't provided to us by the EPLF. The EPLF itself, had such an effective communication system and control over the media even then. And there was also something called the Eritrea Support Committee. Mary Dines was the woman who ran it in Britain, and she was very, very fiercely supportive of the Eritrean position. I mean, so much so that she, we once did some story about, some animal, a sheep or a buck being run over by a truck and being eaten. Well, quite rightly, people were very hungry. And she said, no, it can't be true. I mean, the Eritreans wouldn't kill an animal like that. And I thought, really, this is ridiculous. But I mean, she was, there was a complete support for the Eritrean position from people who were sympathetic. And I was certainly sympathetic to the Eritrean cause. And I thought the EPLF was doing an amazing job. I mean, taking on the Ethiopians with their backing, first by the Americans, then by the Soviet Union, was an extraordinary and, in my view, unique experience. And I have nothing but, admiration even to this day for what Eritrea and Eritreans achieved in fighting for their independence.
Would you be able to look back and see, I liked everything, but there was this thing that stood out for me, and now I realize why this might have happened in Eritrea. Can you make any reflection, any conclusion whatsoever by looking back and comparing to the current state of affairs?
That's very difficult because, as I say, although we did occasionally meet members of the ELF, and who had, were obviously not supportive of the EPLF, the predominant voice in the external world, and certainly in Britain, was the EPLF. So, I can't really give you much of a critical view, since people were, as one of my colleagues said, everybody had drunk the tea. Everybody had sort of bought into the ideas that the EPLF were putting around. So, there was obviously some concern that there wasn't much plurality of views. But what did you expect? The organization was running a guerrilla campaign, and in a war, it's pretty tough to allow people to differ from the position of the leadership. You have to be united. And, I understood that, and, I wasn't critical of it. Now, perhaps I wasn't critical enough, but, one could say the same of practically every liberation movement from the ANC to the PLO. It's usually the same.
Well, Dan Cannell was here the other day, and we were having this conversation, and he readily admitted that maybe he got too close to one side of the Eritrean equation, so to speak. And so you also mentioned about the ELF, and were you objective in sharing as a reporter with the international community that, as a matter of fact, there happens to be also Eritreans on one side of the country who are also duking it out and fighting for the same cause?
Yeah, I described as accurately as possible what I had seen when I was working. As I said, the first time I was in was when I was working with the Labour Party, and then I reported back to the Labour Party and what I had found. Later, I remember going to a second trip. Then we went much deeper into the country, and we were overlooking Keren. I remember coming under shell fire, looking down on the Ethiopian troops walking around in Keren, and I reported that back to the BBC. It wasn't a question of really I described Eritrean forces, but I didn't differentiate which particular group they were supporting. I would say that, I'm sure I said they were members of the EPLF, but the major story was the war, how the war was going, which areas they held, and of course even that I was very rough about, because although I knew we were around Keren, which mountain were we on? There were no maps, and people occasionally told you where you were, but it didn't mean much to me. If I told you that they were in Bleskop in the Free State, would you know where that was? That's in South Africa. If somebody tells you you're in a particular section of a mountain in Eritrea, you haven't a clue whether they're telling you the truth or not.
Martin, one of the essential features of the current situation in South Africa is the spirit of reconciliation. What could we Eritreans learn from that spirit?
I think that one has to learn two things. The first is that there is no monopoly on truth. There should be never any government line on what the truth is. The truth is something that scholars and members of the public should debate and discuss, and that there should be no line on what was true and what was not true. It should be a discursive process. I think that is the first one. And the second one, of course, is that one should also learn to try to put the past behind you. I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which Archbishop Tutu chaired, was an amazing experience, and although there have been criticisms of it, it did help to heal the wounds, because people could go and say, some of the absolutely appalling things that have been done to individuals by the apartheid government could be spoken about, and the apartheid people who had inflicted some of those appalling things could come and say, yes, I did that, and I want to apologize for it. And sometimes they met each other, and that was a very healing process. So, I mean, yes, I think that any country could learn from it as a way of, understanding what it is to forgive. One should never forget, but one should forgive and move beyond the past. Otherwise, you live with it for the rest of time.
Have you had such conversations with Black South Africans, and can you share some of the conversations you had about this subject matter?
Sure. I mean, we've spoken about it a lot, and every Black South African rightly, feels they had a terribly hard time of it, But I mean, to be honest with you, that was 20 years ago, and now people are getting on with their lives. I mean, young South Africans, and don't forget, South Africa, like most countries, is a young country. A tremendous number of them, I mean, I don't know what the percentage is, but it must be a sort of a third or 40% even, didn't even live under apartheid at all. They were children when it was apartheid. So, I mean, apartheid is now 20 years gone. So everybody who's, should we say, almost under 30, didn't really have much experience of that appalling system. So, it's beginning to fade. Of course, the legacy continues. There are still aspects of disadvantage which have to be tackled. But, it is beginning to move into the past.
Do you think, Martin, that had South Africa decided to go after and punish those who perpetrated crimes against South Africans, if they were actually punished in a court of law, do you think the outcome would have been the same?
No, I think it would have been very different, because if you seek vengeance in that way, it would have split South African society permanently, and there would be never any hope of reconciliation. That was why it was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was what it was called, and it did it. It did the job. It brought reconciliation of a kind.
How did this idea of reconciliation come about? Did it have to do with the leadership of Nelson Mandela and the presence of people like Bishop Desmond Tutu? How did this come about, this very healing reconciliation process?
I'm not a specialist on that particular subject, but yes, I mean, it was certainly built into the kind of approach that Nelson Mandela took right from the beginning. I mean, one of the things that I think South Africa was extremely lucky with was that it came after the liberation of Mozambique, because when Mozambique was liberated, and the Portuguese fled, they really destroyed the country that they left. So that, for example, they even poured cement down the partly built lift shafts of buildings that were going up. They removed every light bulb. I mean, it was extraordinary, the sort of vengeance that they inflicted on the country as the whites left. Now, the whites were never going to leave South Africa. You mustn't forget that South African whites have lived in the country for 300 years and more. So, I mean, they are an integral part of the community. You're not going to get rid of them. So it was their country too. They had to find a way of getting around it. Very different situation. But they had learned from the mistakes made in Mozambique. And, the Mozambique leadership came to Mandela and said, look, just don't make the mistakes we made. Don't alienate the whites. You need them if you want the economy to keep going. And that was right. And, both whites and blacks need each other in South Africa. And, thank goodness they found a way forward.
You also wrote a book, I think, was it 2005, The Ethiopia and Eritrea Unfinished Business?
That's right.
And
Yep.
so can you share with us, what did you mean by that? And could you see that there was trouble in the horizon, even in 2005?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was absolutely clear that the fact that the border dispute hadn't been resolved, and that the Eritrean position had not been respected. Whatever one thinks, Badme, the village of Badme, was awarded to Eritrea. I broke that story internationally. And because I don't know if you remember, but when it first came out, the first information was that it had gone to Ethiopia. And I wrote a story saying, no, this is not true. It went to Eritrea. And the Ethiopians were absolutely furious. They sent I think it was the information minister, to see my bosses to try and get me sacked. And I had to fight my corner. And luckily, a few days later, a geographer came out saying, well, actually, no, Martin is right. And I kept my job. But it was tough. That doesn't bother me. And people have a right to criticize anything I say and anything I write. But, when you do a job on the line, you've got to be careful. That was the background. But the Eritreans, unfortunately, having been in the right, the diplomacy that President Isaias insisted upon was so detrimental to the Eritrean position that they threw away the advantage. And it's just an absolute tragedy that, Ethiopia and Eritrea still are at daggers drawn, and with, thousands of troops all along that border, facing each other day after day. And it has been the ruination of Eritrea. And that is the unfinished business. In the end, Ethiopia and Eritrea will certainly be good neighbors. The problem is how to get there. And I long for the day when that happens. I support the peoples of both countries, and I would love to see them reconciled. I don't think there's a major division between the peoples. The problem is always at the level of the governments.
Eritreans also resent that the international community does not seem to hold Ethiopia accountable for even being in a territory that is now settled. So how come there's no pressure? No pressure whatsoever at this time?
Well, you know the answer to that as well as I do. The problem is the position of Ethiopia within the Horn of Africa and its strategic importance to the Western powers and powers in general. I mean, it's not just the West. The Soviet Union and then Russia would have taken a similar position. I'm afraid it is the big brother in the area, and since certainly people in Washington are deeply concerned about Al-Shabaab, and that is their, in a sense, that is the conflict they're most worried about. Then, well, frankly, Eritrea has lost out. I'm not saying this is right. I completely understand and accept the Eritrean frustration with that position, but it is the reality of life. And, diplomacy has to be built around the reality that faces a country and a government and the diplomatic service. And I'm quite sure, having spoken to some people who were in your diplomatic service, that they were as frustrated as anybody else, both with the Western response, but also with the way in which President Isaias threw away opportunity after opportunity. And, his way that he treated the United Nations when they had the force along the border, the UNMI, was appalling. And, the whole thing was just a complete and utter mess. And, of course I understand Eritrean frustration, but Eritrea must take responsibility. I don't mean the people, but the Eritrean government must take responsibility for mishandling the situation so badly. You can't be dealt, no matter how good a hand you are dealt, it depends how you play it.
Well, so do you think these are some of the things that would make people feel you are biased towards Ethiopia, Martin?
I'm not biased towards Ethiopia. I'm talking about reality of power situation. I'm telling you the reality of the situation. I'm not saying whether I like it or not. And who cares what I think? It's not a question of whether I'm in favor of one country or another. I would never be in favor of one country or another. That's not my position. But it's up to people to hold their governments to account. And unfortunately, the Eritrean government is very hard to hold to account.
Eritreans, we're very sensitive about the perceptions of the outside world, especially since we've been, as you know, very shortchanged by decades of international community failure to support us and our cause. And so, as a reporter, you're held to a higher standard, of course. And I just want to draw your attention to a Twitter pertaining to Eritrea votes against a Palestinian state at the UN. What does this tell us about Eritrea's foreign support from Israel? Do you recall that Twitter and the kind of attention, negative attention that it secured you?
Yes, I remember it very well. I made a mistake. It was wrong. I immediately put out a tweet correcting it. But people quite rightly held me to account for the mistake I made. I apologize.
Did you apologize, actually? Because I
Yes.
wondered if you actually did. You apologized. Okay.
Oh, yes,
fair
yes.
enough.
No, I immediately put it right. I said that this was wrong. It was untrue. And I'm sorry I made a mistake. I'm a human being.
Fair enough. So there was also another article. It was an article that you wrote about Eritrea and Ethiopia allergic to persuasion. Tell me about that. What did you mean by that?
Well, you tell me if it's easy to persuade either Eritreans or Ethiopians that they should change their positions. It's not. I would say both sets of people are pretty stubborn. But you mustn't forget that I have not only I've got into more trouble with Ethiopia than I ever have with Eritrea. I mean, the Eritrean government may not like me, but when I published a story which showed that the TPLF had used money from the 84-85 famine to buy weapons, again, there was an absolute storm from the Ethiopian government, and again, I nearly lost my job over it. So the only times that I've ever nearly lost my job, and this only happened twice, both had to do with Ethiopia. Not to any other story that I've ever done. Ethiopia has been more difficult for me than anywhere else. In both cases, quite frankly, I was right.
Well, so there was this piece also you wrote about Ermias and how he became ambassador to China, and then this sentence, which I thought was interesting. It seemed Eritrea would be a beacon of hope and progress across the region. What do you think happened to that beacon of hope as a reporter?
Well, as a reporter, all I can say is that it seems to have been extinguished. One can only look at the situation now where there are more Eritreans fleeing their own country and finding themselves on the shores of Europe than there are Syrians. And Syria, for goodness sake, is in the grip of one of the worst civil wars currently going on in the world, and Eritrea is more or less at peace. Now, what does that tell you about the country? It isn't a beacon of hope anymore.
Eritreans, as you can imagine, are following the transition from what was a dictatorial situation in Burkina Faso to what we hope is a promising experience, hopefully, for the people of Burkina Faso. What do you foresee happening from where you are as far as the Eritrean situation is concerned?
Well, I think the Eritrean situation is clearly unstable. What happened, when the television station was taken over is just one indication of that. And, you cannot rely in the end on foreign forces to buttress your regime, that just in the end will always crumble. So, I mean, it's pretty clear that the situation is unstable. I mean, you will have heard more rumors and stories than I have about, concerns, unhappiness inside the country. And one day that will boil over. Having said that, let me make it clear that I have no more of a crystal ball than anybody else. I can tell you for sure that there was nobody in the early 1980s who predicted the fall of apartheid. I thought it would go on for most of my life, and I don't know anybody else in the media who thought otherwise. The same can be said of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was a complete surprise to most people around the world. Nobody predicted it. So I think attempts to predict the future are useless. All one can say is that what is happening in Eritrea is not a long-term solution. It is not stable. But how it will develop is frankly, I haven't a clue. And, I doubt there are many people who do.
Well, where do you go from here as far as Eritrea is concerned? Are you planning to make still some more efforts to communicate either with people where you are or even reach out to the inside of the Eritrean democratic movement?
Well, I mean, I am involved with people who are active in this country, in Britain, and I was at a meeting in which Ambassador Ande Brahan launched his book recently, and I thought it was an excellent attempt to summarize the situation as he saw it. And yes, I am engaged. I mean, there was recently a 2% campaign against the 2% that is levied on the diaspora, and I helped in a small way with that. So, I mean, yes, I am engaged, but I'm engaged in quite a few other areas as well, including South Africa. So, and in the UK. So it's one is involved in a lot of different things, but Eritrea is very close to my heart, and I would to the end of my days, I will go on reporting and doing what I can to in a very small way to help the Eritrean people. But I would stress that Eritrea's future will be decided absolutely by the Eritrean people. And that is the one thing that I'm absolutely certain about. Nobody else either should or I think can change Eritrea's fate. It is in your hands, and you must take that future with the best way you can.
Martin, this is the final question. Can we expect a book from you on a post-PFDJ Eritrea?
I think that at the moment I'm very much involved in a book on a very early period of South African history, or a fairly early period between the Boer War in 1902 and the First World War, 1914. In that short period, it was a very important part of South African history, and that's what I'm working on. It'll take me at least another year to work on it. But I think the next one that's on my list is Eritrea, and I'll have to discuss with my friends here about what angle it should take, but certainly Eritrea is one of the things that I would like to write about in the near future.
Martin, I'd like to give you this opportunity to actually say the last word. Is there any remark you would like to make or any message you would like to share for that matter about the Eritrean situation?
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say is, that the darkest moment comes just before dawn. And I would end with saying that we say a lot in South Africa, which is the struggle continues. Victory is certain.
And on that very promising note, I just wanted to thank you for joining us. I know it's very difficult to do these conversations. You are very busy, and thank you again for taking the time, and I hope that we will continue to communicate in the future.
I'm happy to do so. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Martin. Have a wonderful day.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest today was Martin Plaut, former BBC reporter and the author of several publications, including War in the Horn, Unfinished Business, Ethiopia and Eritrea at War, and Ethiopia and Eritrea, Allergic to Persuasion.